around my knees and bumping my elbows.
But for the war, these men were like any other possible friends. You can remember the Thomas Hardy's poem, had he and I but met some old ancient inn, we might sit down to write many a nipper can, but ranged as infantry, standing face to face. I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. Strange and curious war is. You shoot a fella down, you treat where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Isn't that it? Especially in our own society, where these men shared a common history, men and women, shared a common love of liberty, gave it slightly different English as it spun through their lives. But at the same time, when death came and there was no more to fight about, the sort of ocean of love and respect and closed over them again, and they were together.
I think we understand what military fame is: to be killed on the field of battle and have our names spelled wrong in the newspapers. William Tecumseh Sherman.
William Tecumseh Sherman remained a soldier, fighting Indians and shunning politics until his retirement in 1883. "If nominated, I will not run," he told a Republican delegation urging him to run for president. "If elected, I will not serve." He died in New York City in the winter of 1891. Among the honorary pallbearers who stood bareheaded in the cold wind outside the church was 82-year-old Joe Johnston, who had fought Sherman in Georgia and the Carolinas. When a friend warned him he might fall ill, Johnston told him, "If I were in Sherman's place and he were standing here in mine, he would not put on his hat." Johnston died 10 days later of pneumonia.
April 1866. There are nights here with the moonlight cold and ghastly, and the whippoorwills and the screech owls alone disturbing the silence, when I could tear my hair and cry alone for all that is past and gone. Mary Chestnut.
When James and Mary Chestnut returned to Mulberry Plantation, they found the old house stripped by Union men, the cotton burned. Mary managed to make a little money selling butter and eggs in partnership with her former slave, and she continued to write. But she never completed the mammoth task of reworking her war diary. Jefferson Davis was never tried for treason, nor could he ever bring himself to ask for a pardon. After 2 years in prison, he was released on bond and spent the rest of his life living off the charity of a wealthy widow and working on a massive memoir, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. He died still persuaded of the justice of his cause at the age of 81. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black man ever elected to the United States Senate, filling the seat last held by Jefferson Davis. Vice President Alexander Stephens was imprisoned briefly and then re-elected to his old congressional seat from Georgia, as if there had never been a Confederacy. Mary Todd Lincoln never recovered from her husband's murder. Her son Tad died in 1871. 5 years later, her eldest son Robert had her committed to a mental institution. She spent her last years in Springfield, rarely leaving a room whose curtains were never raised. For Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, the grim work continued. After the war, she went down to Andersonville and helped arrange dignified burial for thousands of the Union prisoners who had died there, then went on to found the American Red Cross. On November 10, 1865, Henry Wirtz, commandant at Andersonville Prison, was hanged in the yard of the old Capitol Prison in Washington for war crimes. He pleaded he had only followed orders. Walt Whitman published Drum Taps, a book of Civil War poems he thought his finest, then turned largely to prose. His writings revolutionized American literature. Phil Sheridan went out west to take on a new enemy, declaring that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. George Armstrong Custer went west too, carrying with him his belief in his own invincibility. In 1876, the Sioux and Cheyenne proved him wrong. George McClellan stayed abroad for 3 years after losing the election to Lincoln. He heard no slander about himself there, he said. Then he came home and got himself elected governor of New Jersey. The conqueror of Fort Sumter, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, promoted railroads, managed the Louisiana State Lottery, and got rich. Nathan Bedford Forrest promoted railroads too, but failed. In 1867, he became the first imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, but quit when the Klan grew too violent even for him. General Dan Sickles somehow escaped court-martial for his blunder at Gettysburg. He had the leg he lost in the peach orchard mounted in a miniature casket and gave it to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, where he visited it regularly for 50 years. John Bell Hood, who had survived some of the fiercest fighting of the war, died with his wife and daughter in the New Orleans yellow fever epidemic of 1878, leaving 10 orphan children. George Pickett never overcame his bitterness over the destruction of his division at Gettysburg. Suffering from severe depression, he turned down offers of command from the ruler of Egypt and the President of the United States, and ended up in the insurance business. Confederate General James Longstreet joined the Republican Party, served as Grant's minister to Turkey, dared to criticize Lee's strategy at Gettysburg, and for all these things was considered a traitor to the South by his former comrades in arms. Frederick Douglass continued to fight as hard for civil rights as he had against slavery, and became the most powerful black politician in America. A young visitor once asked him what he should do with his life. "Agitate," the old man answered. "Agitate, agitate." Julia Ward Howe helped lead the American Woman Suffrage Association for 55 years. At her funeral in 1910, 4,000 mourners joined in singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Colonel Washington Roebling left the Army Corps of Engineers, finished his father's bridge at Cincinnati, and went on to build the greatest suspension bridge in the world in Brooklyn.
I have fought against the people of the North because I believed they were seeking to wrest from the South its dearest rights. But I have never cherished toward them bitter or vindictive feelings. And I have never seen the day when I did not pray for them.
Robert E. Lee swore renewed allegiance to the United States, and by so doing persuaded thousands of his former soldiers to do the same. He was weary, ailing, and without work in the summer of 1865, when an insurance firm offered him $50,000 just for the use of his name. He turned it down. "I cannot consent to receive pay for services I do not render."
He ended up in the noble way you might have expected after you'd learned to expect it. He didn't know what to do with himself after the war. His profession was gone, even his country was gone. And he was approached with a good deal of hesitation by these people from a little school called Washington College. And he accepted the presidency of Washington College. He had an annual salary of $1,500 and a house to live in. And he spent the rest of his life at what after his death was called Washington Lee.
"The greatest mistake of my life," he said, "was taking a military education." And whenever his students and those of the neighboring Virginia Military Institute marched together, Lee made a point of staying out of step.